Hello and welcome. I'll be presenting today work Spatial Vision has done for the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning on the collection of government land use information. Land use is often implied from the government authority owning the land. For example, land owned by the Department of Education is likely to be identified as used for educational purposes, or land managed by Parks Victoria or a similar authority, a park for example, can be identified as a park or reserve. However, this is not always the case, and this can also ignore complementary or associated uses within an area. Land Use Victoria within the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning found that there was no single data set on government land use in Victoria that provided an authoritative information about how land is truly being used. The need to develop this spatial data set that would identify how state government land use is currently being used was identified. This data set would need also to be integrated with other spatial and non-spatial data sets for a variety of complex analytical and decision-making functions. For each unit of land, it was required to identify a primary land use, that is, the main actual use of the land in question. And secondary to this, if possible, there was a need to identify up to 3 co-located or secondary land uses. For example, car parks, community facilities, or sporting fields. Once defined, the coverage proportions of each of these land uses were also needed. The solution was to be developed in such a way as to be repeatable, and as new properties were identified or new locations used, to be transferable to government GIS analysts. The approach proposed and developed by Spatial Vision was at its core a data-driven process. This was informed by comprehensive government spatial data sets, such as the VicMap suite of data, council-held data, utility and transportation authority data, as well as other open platform databases. Our solution to address the problem was to develop a series of workflows. These were designed to break up and categorize primary land use into an ordered hierarchy, with certain uses having a higher order or weighting over others. For example, transportation was an initial or a top-tier land use. This was driven by the use of identified data sets that could attribute land use in an ordered hierarchy workflow. And it was critical really to get this principal land use correct, as this framed how we dealt with other land uses. For each property, we identified the primary land use, and then we ran a series of processes within these areas to designate secondary uses, using identified lower order data sets. This was done using the same workflow hierarchy process. Within the area, primary land use then informed an initial 100% of the land use. And as secondary land uses were introduced, they effectively were extracted from the principal land use, and the proportions of such were calculated. Final to this, we actually signed an Australian Valuation Property Classification Code. Overall, we automated this process where possible, but there were some visual interpretation and validation points required where data sets were not available. As we can see here, this is La Trobe University, identified as a tertiary education institution. We can see each of the co-located land uses slowly being extracted, being a sports field, a car park, or a park and reserve. And what's left behind is the actual principle of primary land use. Our solution was engineered with a view not only to introduce efficiencies in critical decision-making and inform and drive strategic planning, development and regulatory compliance activities, but it was also developed to be adaptable, repeatable, and achieve incremental cost savings for the department over time. This data set is enabling new streams of insight to be considered, including projects aimed at understanding the land portfolios of Victorian universities and also rail transportation corridors. When completed, these will provide useful insights and be a particularly beneficial repository for government to support land use decision-making by having a complete picture of current land use situations. Overall, the solution provided was an adaptable process to meet current and future data requirements and project needs. Thank you.